Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we begin to look at Revelation chapter 12, a chapter that opens the second half of the drama that is the book of Revelation. It is a scene that introduces us to three celestial figures: a woman clothed with the sun, the moon at her feet, and 12 stars at her head; a dragon, a ravenous red dragon determined to destroy the woman and her child; and a divine child, a figure steeped in the messianic expectations of Israel. In this section, John's vision weaves together three threads. First, a thread of astral prophecy, the idea that the stars themselves can tell us something specific about God's plan for his creation. Second, a thread of Greco-Roman mythology, background information with which John and his readers were familiar from their milieu, and which I think explains somewhat why the images are chosen this way in this passage. And most importantly, a thread of the gospel of Jesus Christ, including those Old Testament prophecies that told Israel to expect the coming Messiah. It is a truly breathless scene that unfolds at the opening of the second act of Revelation. Thank you for joining me as we examine the treasures in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. Chapter 11 ends with a kind of crescendo grand finale, as if it is the end of the first act of a great Broadway play. The climax of the story where all the characters come on stage and they have one grand chorale before the curtain closes and intermission arrives. And I believe we have this intermission, as it were, between chapters 11 and 12. What makes it feel like an intermission is that chapter 12 begins in a completely different spot than chapter 11 ended. I just want to read all 6 verses to get a feel for just how different it is we're talking about. And then we're going to go through and look at these 6 verses in more detail. But here's Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and who was pregnant and was crying out because she was having birth pains, and was in torment to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 royal headbands, and his tail swept away a third of the stars from heaven, and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, in order that whenever she gave birth to her child, he could devour it. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is going to shepherd all the nations with an iron rod, and her child was snatched away to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared there by God, so that they could feed her there for 1,260 days. For the most part, the end of chapter 11 is wrapping things up with the final second coming. And then we start chapter 12, and we've got a woman in the sky, and a dragon, and she's pregnant. None of these things have any precedent in any of the chapters before here. They just pop out of literally nowhere. And that's why I think that what we have here is the beginning of Act 2. And it feels like when the curtain rises on Act 2, you've walked into the wrong theater, because it doesn't feel at all like the continuation of the story that we ended with at the end of Act 1. I think that's by design, and it's because things are going to unfold at a different level. Up through chapter 11, I believe the focus is on a limited area and time, the time of the Roman Empire. Now, it can metaphorically or by analogy be applicable to any empire, because I don't think God only cared about the people of Rome and his faithful people in Rome. I think he cares about his faithful people in every place on earth at all times. And I believe the kinds of judgment that are discussed throughout chapters 6 through 9 are all kinds of judgment that God can pour out on any nation, empire, country that is oppressing his people. It is in that sense that I very much concur with some of the conclusions of those who see Revelation generally in that light. But I think that the emphasis is for those 7 churches receiving this letter in the first place, talking about the people they've lost, the grieving they're in the middle of because of people who they loved have died, or the persecutions they're suffering, and the indignities of being persecuted in their lifetime, being vindicated for that. I think up through chapter 9 is focused on that scope. But the beginning of chapter 12, and from here through the end, the scope is bigger. We're talking now about the cosmic struggle of God versus the forces of evil, the dragon, and God's people on a bigger scale, a celestial scale, literally, as we have it unfolding at the beginning of chapter 12. And we're talking about a different time frame, because at the end of chapter 11, Christ is returning to rule on earth, and everything is reaching its conclusion with the dead being judged. That's always understood to be one of the last things that happens before we reach our eternal state at the end of all ends. But here in chapter 12, we start out with this reference in verse 5 that is suggestive that Jesus hasn't even been born yet when chapter 12 opens. I'm going to cut to Revelation 12:5 and talk about why I think this is pointing to Jesus. It is not universally accepted by all commentaries that this is about Jesus, but I think it is. I'm going to make my case for why it is Jesus, and why then, therefore, the whole time has shifted in the perspective of the narrative. Revelation 12:5 says, "And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is going to shepherd all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched away to God and to his throne." A key thing that lets us know that this is about Jesus is that phrase, the child who is going to shepherd all the nations with an iron rod. This is a phrase that is about the Messiah. It was established as a comment about the Messiah all the way back in Psalm 2. I think it's interesting that some of the wording from Psalm 2 came up in chapter 11 in a little different way. And here we're back at Psalm 2 again in chapter 12. But by looking at this phrase about this child shepherding the nations with an iron rod, it comes from verse 9, but I want to read verses 6 through 9 because it establishes context. Psalm 2, 6 through 9. "But as for me," the me here is Yahweh, "as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will tell the decree. Yahweh said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask from me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and your possession the ends of the earth. You will break them with an iron rod. Like a potter's vessel, you will shatter them." I'm using the Lexham English Bible. This is one standard way of translating this verse, of verses. And that's based on the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the scriptures, the oldest available Hebrew text, except for some scraps from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, the Dead Sea Scrolls are still partial in what they contain of the Old Testament. But the Masoretic text is the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have. And so it is the text upon which most Bible translations are based. However, Revelation was saying he will shepherd them with an iron rod. Here, Psalm 2:9 says you will break them with an iron rod. That sounds quite different, as if one is helpful and kind, shepherding, and here it's talking about breaking them. But the reason that we have that difference is because the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, uses the word for shepherding in the same spot. In the Septuagint version of Psalm 2, it reads like this: But I was appointed by him in Mount Zion, his holy place, announcing the ordinance of the Lord. The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have fathered you. Ask from me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance, and as your possession the ends of the earth. You will shepherd them with a steel rod. Like a vessel of a potter, you will break them. So there is still breaking in the context, but not in that particular phrase. The phrase itself, you will shepherd them with a steel rod, is exactly identical to the phrase used in Revelation 12:5. And this is a messianic promise about the Lord saying, You are my son, today I have fathered you, or in the King James Version, You are my son, today I have begotten you. The only begotten Son of the Father is Christ. And this is a messianic psalm talking about Christ. I believe we're talking about the birth of Christ in Revelation 12:5. That means that at the end of chapter 11, Christ is coming back for his second coming. And at the beginning of chapter 12, Christ isn't even born yet until verse 5. It's a chronological shift as much as it is a shift of scope. So far from being a recapitulation where chapters 12 through 22 are just recapitulating the same things that happened from chapters 4 through 10 or 11. Sometimes it is said that the seals are the same thing as the trumpets, which are the same thing as the bowls. The same events are recapitulated multiple times throughout the book. I don't think so. I believe that the first half is focused on a more limited scope, and the second half is about a more universal scope. Now, some of the things that are going to happen in the second half are still happening on Earth. Forces that are spiritual in nature and designed from behind the scenes are playing themselves out in real time on the surface of the Earth, and therefore certain things are still geographically bound. But I do believe it is dealing with the larger issues of good versus evil, you might say, or God versus the devil, God versus the dragon, as it may be characterized here in chapter 12. I believe this shift in scope also explains why, at this point, John brings three different threads and weaves them all together into this one passage, this first paragraph of Revelation 12. I believe John pulls in together elements of astral prophecy. I'm going to explain what that term means in more detail. We're going to delve into each one of these three threads to a little bit of a degree. Now, the second one, the Greco-Roman mythology, is, I think, the least important, but still adds some element of understanding as to what's going on with this dragon trying to swallow the child at its birth. That is an unusual image, and I believe the reason for it comes out of Greco-Roman mythology, which John's audience would have been familiar with, and which apparently John himself was enough familiar with to use as an element of his understanding about the vision that he had. And then the gospel of Jesus, of course, that is the most important. These first 6 verses tell the story of the gospel of Jesus in their own way. Now, the first of the 3 is astral prophecy. And astrology asserts that the stars themselves have some influence, and the arrangement of the stars is going to influence how people live their lives on Earth. If you're born under a certain sign, under Leo, like I was, or Cancer or Virgo, or any of the signs of the zodiac, your lifestyle, your attitudes, your personality is somehow shaped by the stars and their alignment at the day you were born. That's astrology, and that's not what astral prophecy is about. It doesn't say the stars in themselves have any power. What astral prophecy asserts is that the arrangement of the stars reflect God's design, and the patterns in the heavens reflect something about how God has designed and ordered the universe. Because the usual cycles of the celestial objects were signs of routine appointed times. For example, the Sabbath each week. How do you know it's a Sabbath? Because the sun has set and risen 7 times. It is the sun that defines when the Sabbath is by its setting and rising cycles. How is the Feast of Trumpets determined? By the cycle of the moon. In fact, there is no word for month in Hebrew. There is only a word for moon. The times were measured by the sun rising and setting and the moon's phases. Those were the two things that kept the clock of the ancient world. All of the feasts of Israel were based on the cycles of the moon. And that doesn't match our solar year. That's why Easter changes every year. And they had to periodically adjust their calendar because it gets off. And if they had never adjusted the calendar, they would have been celebrating the spring festivals in the middle of winter. But unfortunately, we have no record of how they made those adjustments, but we know they must have, because a solar year is off by a quarter of a day. We know that. But a lunar year is off by more. And if you try to go by everything only by the cycles of the moon, you're going to get way off even faster than you're off if you follow the cycles of the sun. That's all to say, though, that when it came to knowing when a Sabbath was, that was determined by the cycle of the sun and the moon. These determined the appointed days for worship on a routine basis. But then there were rare occasions that were seen with things in the heavens, like eclipses. Eclipses still follow a cycle, and if you follow it long enough, you can find repetitions there, but they were still very rare, and the ordinary person on the street couldn't have predicted them. Comets, by the same logic that if the cycles of the sun and the cycles of the moon and the cycles of the stars, these regular processions of the stars on the ecliptic, the zodiac, for example, those are all predictable. But then there are these unpredictable and yet still celestial events. And they believed, the Jews and most ancient peoples believed, that just as those regular cycles were predictable and they indicated sacred times, these unpredictable ones were also indicating something sacred, something that God was doing, and they paid attention to them. And that's what astral prophecy is that the signs in the heavens point to something God is doing with the design of his creation. I'm going to start at the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." Well, the seasons, the days, and the years are all predictable things, but they are also signs. And the word there for sign is exactly the same word that would be used for a miraculous sign, or God doing something extraordinary as a sign. And that's what the lights were for. The stars, the moon, and the sun. They were there for signs as well as for seasons and for days and years. The most basic application of that is in the keeping of the Sabbath and the keeping of the feasts at the beginning of each month, and then the regular recurring feasts that were still based on monthly cycles, that is, the cycles of the moon. The idea that the stars and the sun and the moon carried meaning with the way that they moved in the sky. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4, and I'm just going to end with the first part of verse 4, says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." Now, this is very commonly quoted to convey the awe of the magnitude of God's creation. And yes, it does convey that. But the words of this psalm suggest something more particular than just awe. It reveals knowledge, not just a feeling, not just an impression of awesomeness. It conveys something about God's creation and about how God is working in his creation by what happens in the heavens. Look at all the communication verbs just in these few verses: declare, proclaim, pour out speech, reveal knowledge. Their voice is heard. These are all communicative verbs about what's going on in the heavens. It's something beyond just a feeling, although it is awesome to look at the sky, but there is something more there, at least according to this psalm. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. This is a very practical example of astral prophecy. They saw something in the heavens that communicated that someone important had been born, a king of the Jews had been born. Now, exactly how they knew that is a matter of speculation. We can assume that they had some exposure to Jewish scripture and Jewish prophetic ideas because of Daniel and all the other exiles that were taken. Ezekiel would be an example. Esther is another example. All of these Jews that were taken into exile in Persia, but we don't know exactly how they put two and two together, but they did. And the only reason they did is because they connected signs in the heavens with things that were going to happen on earth. That's astral prophecy. And Romans chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, sort of reaffirms Psalm 19, 1 through 4, as communicating something specific. Paul says to the church at Rome, So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? That would be the Gentiles, the people not yet exposed to the gospel by preaching. Have they not heard? Paul says, Indeed, they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the heavens from Psalm 19, because he basically quotes it verbatim. Psalm 19:4. Their voice goes out through all the earth, their words to the end of the world. Paul believes that the heavens have declared something specific about Christ. The word of Christ has gone out by the roll of the heavens. What could he mean? Now, obviously, there are certain details about Christ. The fact that he preached the Sermon on the Mount and what the details of that would mean. The fact that he died on a cross for your sins. The fact that he rose in 3 days. Some of these are details that could not have been proclaimed by the heavens. They're just details that you have to have explained in words. But something about Christ could have been known, enough to say, there's something going on here I need to learn more about. And perhaps the Magi, there in Matthew 2, are giving us that clue. They figured it out. They knew something was going on by watching the heavens and hearing the words that the heavens were proclaiming. And they showed up in Jerusalem at the right time. So maybe Paul is connecting the dots there for what's going on with the Magi, what's going on in Psalm 19, and with his own assertion that, yes, the Gentiles have heard something about Christ. Dr. Heiser has suggested that what Paul is getting at in Romans 10 could be described here in Revelation 12, possibly. How is it that Revelation 12 gives us a hint as to what it might mean that the skies have conveyed something about the birth of Christ? Chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 again. And I've highlighted in the screen some of the key phrases for understanding this as astral prophecy. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and who was pregnant and was crying out because she was having birth pains, and was in torment to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 royal headbands. The astral prophecy take on these verses is that the woman is the constellation Virgo. Virgo is one of the few celestial constellations that it depicts a woman. And most of the other constellations that are of women have women in some kind of tableau, sitting on a throne or doing something. The constellation Virgo is basically just a standing woman. It also fits with our biblical narrative, which we haven't kind of got to yet, but Virgo is Latin for virgin, And so when we start to overlap the Christian message about Christ's birth, born to a virgin, it connects with the constellation Virgo on that level as well. Then they have the dragon. There's actually two constellations that could be called the dragon. There's one that actually the name of the constellation is dragon. That's the constellation Draco, Draco being Greek for dragon. However, Hydra is directly beside Virgo. It's at her feet in certain ways. I mean, all the constellations are sort of abstract in any case, but Hydra being adjacent to Virgo could be described as being at her feet. That the woman was clothed with the sun could indicate that Virgo is positioned in the sky during the day when the sun would be inside the constellation Virgo, which would mean this is not something you could actually see. You would have to know the positions of the constellations and have them charted on paper and know where they were in relationship to the sky to know, oh, there's the sun. That's where Virgo would be if we could see it. Because once the sun is in the sky, you can't see the constellations. This would have to be something that was understood by those who studied the stars and knew the positions of the constellations and knew that at this point of the day, based on how they move, and we can see them, and we know that they disappear during the daytime hours, but there in the sky where the sun is right now, there would be the constellation Virgo. That's how that would be understood, clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet. This would again mean that the moon was positioned somewhere near Virgo, ideally somewhere near the what would be considered the foot of the constellation. I just want to show you a slide of Virgo and Hydra and how they are in close proximity to one another. The figure of Hydra in mythology was considered to be seven-headed. In the mythology, if you cut off any one of Hydra's heads, two of them grow back. So the number of heads on Hydra is always changing because every time somebody goes up against it, and Hercules was one of the famous ones who went up against Hydra, you cut off one of Hydra's heads, two grow back. So it only has 7 heads until someone cuts one off, and then it has 8. There's Hydra, potentially 7-headed dragon. Let me read what Dr. Michael Heiser says. The sun must be in the Virgin constellation, that's Virgo, while the moon is simultaneously at her feet for John's vision to be accurately interpreted astronomically. Because of the moon's behavior relative to the ecliptic and Virgo in any given year, the 20-day window, and he mentioned that that's a window when Virgo is in the same spot as the sky, as the sun. That happens every year for about 20 days in any given year. But you add in the moon, and he says this, it narrows to a roughly 90-minute period in which to astronomically pinpoint the birth of the child. It still doesn't tell you which year, but it tells you about what time of year it could happen on any given day, which happens to be in September. We're going to get to that in a second. He goes on with a little more specificity, which is not part of Revelation 12, but is connected potentially to that star that the Magi saw. The constellation Leo was considered a royal constellation since it was dominated by the star Regulus, which was known by astrologers as the king star. He goes into some more details on this in the book, just cutting to the chase here. The status of Regulus in Leo is important because on one of the possible dates when Virgo is in the sky, the sun is in the sky, and the moon is in the right position, on one of those dates, the star Regulus came into conjunction with Jupiter. As the largest planet, Jupiter was considered the king planet in astrotheological thinking of the first century. As a result, the constellation Leo, the messianic sign of the Lion of Judah, to the Jews who read the heavens, in other words, they pay attention to these things, had 2 conjoined signs of a royal birth within it. The 2 signs being Regulus and then Jupiter. This combination of astronomical signs produces a unique set of circumstances that can only be accounted for by one date, and in point of fact, a 90-minute window on that date. This date, as we will see momentarily, has dramatic significance in the Jewish calendar. He's going to go on to that in much more detail in the book. I'm just going to tell you right now, it was the first day of the month of Tishri, which is the seventh month of the sacred calendar. That month includes things like the Day of Atonement. It's a very important, significant month of the year, and the first day would have been the day with this all combines. According to these signs in the heavens, the date of Jesus' birth was September 11th, 3 BC. So that is the conclusion we draw if we assume that Revelation 12 is talking about the astro prophecy of Jesus' birth. And if we can join that with the idea that perhaps the star of the Magi was Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus. Dr. Heiser goes into some details on that. And actually, Dr. Heiser is quoting another scholar. This was not original with him. I have some software, which I bought specifically for the purpose of tracking all this down and being able to do some visuals with it. And that software allowed me to capture what the sky over Jerusalem would look like on September 11th, 3 BC, at the appropriate time of day within that 90-minute window. And here you can see that the sun is obviously the bright spot, and then it's right next to Virgo. The moon is marked by a flag down below Virgo, and Jupiter is above next to the point in Leo, which is the star Regulus. So this is the tableau from the heavens that Dr. Heiser suggests indicates the day of Jesus' birth. If Jesus was born in conjunction with that month, specifically as a messianic harbinger, then that has certain theological overtones. But which day of the year Jesus was born doesn't change his mission, his atonement on the cross, or anything else as far as our essential theology is concerned. But it is an interesting possibility that this might have been something of what Paul had in mind when he said that the heavens have declared something about Jesus' birth. The second thread that John is pulling here is the Greco-Roman mythology. I found a succinct reference to the mythology that would be relevant to this tableau in the commentary on Revelation by Craig Kester. It's part of the Anchor Yale Bible commentary series. They have actually 2 volumes on Revelation. One was written many years ago, and then they had an updated one. This is the update, volume 38A. Craig Koster goes into this description of a mythology which may be behind Revelation 12, 1 through 6. Greco-Roman sources tell of a woman named Leto who was pregnant by Zeus. Her antagonist was Python, the dragon, who tried to kill her in order to prevent her from giving birth. She was rescued by the north wind, which carried her away to the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea. There, she gave birth to Apollo and Artemis, who received arrows as gifts. 4 days later, Apollo pursued the dragon, soon slaying the monster to avenge his mother. Now, obviously, what we have in Revelation 12, these first 6 verses, is not moment for moment a retelling of this myth. However, there are some big picture similarities. That is, a dragon trying to eat a pregnant woman who is pregnant with a supernatural child, and this woman being saved by natural forces. Now, we haven't quite got to the point where the natural forces save the woman yet, because that's a little bit later in the chapter. That doesn't really come to the fore until around verse 13. So we're not going to see some of that until we get into some later part of chapter 12. But there is the suggestion that natural forces help to save the woman from the dragon. And that is suitable with this myth about Leto and Python. I think we can see that possibly the vision that John received and is telling us would have resonated with those Greco-Roman readers of the book of Revelation, most of whom were Christian, but they were also Greco-Roman to begin with, so they knew this mythology. And when they would have heard Revelation 12 being read and these figures coming to the fore, I think this myth would have been firing in the backs of their minds. What I think is interesting is that what is not part of chapter 12 is the last bit of the myth, that Apollo kills the dragon. The son of the woman the dragon was trying to swallow kills the dragon. Of course, Jesus is the son of the woman in chapter 12. He will kill the dragon. he is going to be that dragon slayer born of the woman who was saved from the dragon. And I think that that may be why it's woven in here. The reality is even grander than what the myth would say. I'm going to walk through verse by verse, Revelation 12, 1 through 6, and look at it from the gospel of Jesus, which includes Old Testament messianic prophecies, because that is part of the gospel. Revelation 12:1, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. I think the closest echo we have to this scene alone, a woman with the moon and the sun and the stars, is back in Genesis with Joseph and his dreams. He doesn't dream about a woman with stars and the sun and the moon, but he has a dream about the sun, moon, and stars that I think gives us some insight here. Genesis 37, 9 through 10. Then Joseph dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you've dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? So the context is a little different. There is no woman here, and there are 11 stars instead of 12. But the idea is that the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars do represent Jacob and his family, the tribes of Israel. Jacob is Israel. We're talking about Israel being represented by the sun, the moon, and the stars. There would naturally be 12 and not 11 because Joseph himself represents one of the tribes, and so the stars represent the 12 tribes. I'm going to take that as the way I interpret the woman in Revelation 12, as a celestial symbol of the people of Israel. That is an interpretive choice. There are other choices that could be made for reasons that I will explain in our next lesson when we get into the latter part of chapter 12. I believe the woman represents specifically national Israel, ethnic Israel. Chapter 12, verse 2. This woman was pregnant and was crying out because she was having birth pains and was in torment to give birth. Naturally, we might associate this with Mary actually being pregnant and being ready to give birth. But the idea of Israel having birth pains is actually a pretty common image in the Old Testament for Israel suffering under oppression before God delivers her. There are several places that I could go to, but I'm going to go to one that I think is particularly relevant for how the story unfolds. I'm going to go to Micah chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, which say this. Now, why do you cry aloud? That's the people of Israel. Why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished, that pain seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. This is the southern kingdom, the Judah, who will be taken into captivity in Babylon. But during this period of time, before she is rescued, she is like a woman in labor. This idea that the woman in the heavens is having labor pains is about more than just her being pregnant. It's about her suffering under persecution and hoping and waiting for rescue. And that is embodied in the woman in the skies, in the heavens, by describing her as being in labor pains. Revelation 12, verse 3. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 royal headbands. Like the story of the woman unfolding in more detail later on in chapter 12, so does the story of the dragon. We're going to be following this dragon throughout several chapters here in the latter half of the book of Revelation. In fact, I think the story is partially told from the dragon's point of view, starting here in chapter 12. So we're going to be talking about this dragon a bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I do want to hit on some of the passages where a first century Jew or Christian who is familiar with the Septuagint Old Testament would be hearing echoes of the Old Testament here in this passage by the reference to the dragon. Things that are lost on us because the word dragon doesn't show up in our English translations, and because the equivalent term wasn't used in Hebrew. It was used in Greek when the Greek translators put it into Greek from Hebrew. But let's look back. For example, Exodus chapter 7, verse 12. This is when Pharaoh's magicians were copying what Moses and Aaron were doing, and Moses and Aaron were in front of Pharaoh. Each one of the magicians threw down their staff, and they became dragons. But Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs down. We would read that as serpents. We think of them as snakes. But in the Septuagint, they're dragons. That's the word Draco used there. In Psalm 73:13, you strengthened the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the dragons in the water. So there, God is overcoming dragons in a creation act. Psalm 148, verse 7, praise the Lord from the earth, you dragons, and all the abysses. Interesting here that both dragons and abysses are mentioned, and we already have seen how the abyss can be a watery abyss, like the sea, or a fiery abyss, like where the locusts came up with the smoke in the book of Revelation. Finally, I want to cite Isaiah 27, verse 1, because it talks about a conflict between Yahweh and the dragon. On that day, God will bring the holy and great and mighty sword against the dragon, a fleeing serpent, against the dragon, a twisted serpent. He will slay the dragon. This verse shows how the serpent's imagery and the dragon imagery are very much intertwined, twisted together, as it were. And this shows that God is going to bring his sword against that dragon. And when Revelation 12 opens, someone who's familiar with the Old Testament passages is going to hear, aha, here is where that conflict will begin. The dragon is going to face that mighty sword at some point. Now, as far as the dragon being red, that's an interesting detail. I could not find anything that would talk about it. None of the dragons mentioned in the Old Testament are particularly red. It's kind of just assumed that dragons are red. I have a quote from the Iliad in which there's mention of redness with a dragon. And again, we can see how the dragon is like a serpent or like a watery creature. And that's one thing I want to point out, is that the dragons of the Old Testament were often associated with the sea, with water. We think of dragons as being like fire creatures. We think of Middle Earth dragon, where they breathe fire. Dragons in the Old Testament were much more likely to breathe water than they were to breathe fire, because they were always associated with the chaos of the sea and the watery abyss, not so much with fire. But they were red. At least we see a red dragon here. I'll read this quote from the Iliad just to give it context. We were ranged about a fountain, offering hecatombs to the gods upon their holy altars, and there was a fine plane tree from beneath which there welled a stream of pure water. Then we saw a sign, for Zeus sent a fearful serpent, a dracon, out of the ground, and with blood-red stains upon its back, and it darted from under the altar on the plane tree. So even though it's translated in the Iliad as a serpent, the word is actually a dracon. It's the word for dragon. The dragon came out of the ground with blood-red stains. So it was a red dragon. And it just seems to be a traditional picture for the dragons to be red. I was interested in the diadem, or the headband, the royal headband on the heads of the dragon, because it is not a typical word for crown. It is a word that is specifically about a sign of royalty among Persians. It was a blue band trimmed with white on the tiara, hence it became a symbol of royalty generally. So yes, it was recognized as a sign of royalty, whether you were from Persia or not, but it was a Persian kind of crown. They used it the most. Why is that important? Well, because of what I see as the role of Babylon, the literal Babylon, the Persian Babylon, in the unfolding of the story of the dragon and the beast. This is the very first hint or clue that we have that that ancient Persian empire of Babylon is going to be relevant, because the crowns on the dragon are Persian in style. In verse 4, his tail swept away a third of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth, And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, in order that whenever she gave birth to her child, he would devour it. And there are two main sections to this verse. The first one is the third of the stars being swept from heaven. Although this is sometimes characterized as Satan bringing a third of the stars with him as bad guys, this third of the stars that he sweeps down are all the fallen angels. I don't think that's what it really means. I think it's a allusion back to Daniel and to stars falling in Daniel 8. Daniel 8, verses 8 through 10. This is one of the visions that Daniel has, and then he has an explanation for it. And so I'm included on this same slide the explanation given to him by an angel in verse 24. So the first part is verses 8 through 10, and then the part by itself is the angel's explanation. Here's what Daniel 8, 8 through 10 says. The goat was a symbol for Alexander the Great and for the Alexander's kingdom. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. Now, the explanation from the angel comes a bit later, and he says this in verse 24. The king, represented by this horn, he will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. Now, verse 10 suggests that this horn is throwing down the starry host of heaven. Seems to be a reference to heavenly powers, like angelic beings. But then in verse 24, he says, this horn represents a king who is going to destroy those who are mighty, the holy people, which would be faithful Jews in the context of Daniel 8. I think what we can draw away from Daniel 8 is the idea that there is some kind of interplay between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. Casting down stars from heaven and persecuting the people on earth are all interconnected. In some sense, both are happening at the same time. People are suffering on earth, and the starry host are suffering in heaven. And that's happening together in Daniel 8's vision. I think it's implied in the Revelation 12 vision as well, that the third of the stars being swept from heaven by the flick of the dragon's tail represents both disruption in the heavenly realms among heavenly beings and persecution on earth and the suffering of people who are faithful to God. And what's being emphasized, I think, here is that the dragon isn't even trying. He's just flicking his tail, and mass destruction is happening. This dragon is depicted as very powerful, where even his tail has tremendous destructive power. That's important for the second half of the story. We'll get to that next time. But the second half of verse 4 says, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth in order that whenever she gave birth to her child, he could devour it. When we come to this with a gospel story in mind, and if we think about the woman as being somehow connected to Mary, I mean, I think she's representative of Israel generally, but Mary obviously is the literal woman who gives birth to Christ. And so when we think about Mary and the danger that she was in, and which Jesus was in while giving birth, it puts us back to that scene with the Magi, basically, and with the birth of Christ, but in a slightly different place in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been deceived by the wise men, became very angry, and he sent soldiers and executed all the children in Bethlehem and in all the region around it from the age of 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined precisely from the wise men. This depiction of the woman being in jeopardy, and particularly the life of the child being in jeopardy by the dragon, that puts me in mind of Herod and his desire to kill the next king of the Jews by whatever means necessary, and the need for them then to flee, which the woman does in the story as well, flee. I'm not going to spend time on Revelation 12:5. We've already talked about that in detail near the first of this lesson, but I do want to finish out the quote from Micah chapter 5. I quoted from Micah 4 earlier, but it's just a couple of verses later that we get to this section of Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. Micah may have been picking up an echo of Psalm 2 on his own right by mentioning about how this ruler in Israel would stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. To me, this whole section of Micah resonates with the same imagery and language of Revelation 12, 1 through 6. Finally, there's verse 6. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared there by God so that they could feed her there for 1,260 days. Why this doesn't exactly match with Mary is that the child of the woman giving birth has already been taken up into heaven, snatched up to God's throne before the woman flees into the wilderness. We have in Revelation 12:5 basically a one-verse summary of Jesus' entire life, born and ascended all in one verse. But then this happens to the woman. She flees to the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. And there is, of course, a very interesting overlap between this event and the two witnesses. This mention of 1,260 days. It's the exact same period of time that was the prophecy for the witnesses in Revelation 11:3. I will grant authority to my two witnesses. They will prophesy for 1,260 days, dressed in sackcloth. And then Revelation 12:6, the woman fled to the wilderness where she had a place prepared there by God so that they could feed her there for 1,260 days. I see strong connections between some of these numbers as they appear in chapter 11 and as they appear later in the book of Revelation. But honestly, I don't see a strong correlation. The only thing they seem to have in real common as a strong connection is that they are both times of protection. The two witnesses are protected for that 1,260 days. They're unassailable. Even if somebody wants to harm them, he gets destroyed by fire, it says in the context of chapter 11. And here the woman flees and she is protected supernaturally for 1,260 days. Maybe as we unpack some of the rest of chapter 12, the 3.5 years will click a little more. There is actually another mention of this same period of time in a little different way of talking about it later in chapter 12. So we're not quite finished with the woman, not quite finished with the dragon, and certainly not quite finished with Jesus, because even though he only gets one verse in this section, he dominates the whole rest of the book of Revelation. Verse 7 opens with some of the most tantalizing wording of perhaps the entire Bible. There was war in heaven. What can you do with an opening like that? And we're going to unpack this war through the rest of Revelation chapter 12 next week. Thanks again for joining me in this walk through the book of Revelation. Next week, we will continue our look at Revelation chapter 12 and the unfolding war in heaven. As always, I welcome your feedback, your comments, and questions here on YouTube or at the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group on Facebook. Until we have an opportunity to meet again and examine the treasures in the biblical text, may the Lord be with you.